In our previous discussions, we talked about how America's original 3 million WASP settlers initially were the most government-averse people. They championed republicanism and individualism, yet they ultimately united as one to form a shared identity as Americans. But today, this identity is crumbling. The question, who is an American, has become increasingly difficult to answer. 100 years ago, if you asked, who is an American? The answer was clear: WASPs. Throughout the 19th century, American was synonymous with white Protestant. During this period, many groups immigrated to America. There were Irish and Italian Catholics. There were Eastern European Orthodox and Catholic Slavs. There were also Jewish immigrants. The government deliberately dispersed these groups. They provided substantial assistance to help them quickly integrate into existing communities. Large companies established their own English classes for immigrants. Smaller companies employed fewer immigrants. When they couldn't form complete classes, they would sponsor community night schools. Governments at all levels strongly supported English education for immigrants. The Federal Department of Labor even established a special naturalization bureau. Its purpose was to help immigrants integrate into local communities as quickly as possible. As I mentioned earlier, America is a country with extremely strong religious consciousness. Throughout its history, it has experienced 4 major religious revival movements. Each of these Great Awakenings powerfully reshaped American society. The first Great Awakening resulted in the Revolutionary War. The second led to the abolition of slavery. The third Great Awakening can be viewed as a reaction against abolition. After Black people gained freedom, mainstream society began vigorously promoting white superiority. They particularly emphasized the superiority of white people born in America. Previously, even among whites, WASPs had discriminated against white immigrants. After the Civil War, because Black people were free, WASPs changed their approach. They tempered their emphasis on Puritan superiority. They adopted a more inclusive attitude toward other whites. Their new message was simple: regardless of your origin or religion, if you were white and born in America, you were considered equal. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution passed in 1868. It gave Black adult males the right to vote. The Third Great Awakening emphasized identity based on skin color, but it became logically inconsistent when Black men had voting rights while white women did not. Consequently, women's equality and further democratization became major political demands. These became the main achievements of the Third Great Awakening. However, discrimination based on religion and race didn't disappear easily. Discrimination against Italian and Irish whites continued for a long time. This issue wasn't fully resolved until World War II. The war stirred patriotism and voluntary service for a common cause. It enhanced national unity through shared enmity against common enemies. World War II propelled racial equality forward. Later, the urgency of the Cold War further helped end racial discrimination and segregation. Intermarriage among whites over 2 or 3 generations also played a role. It led to dilution of the Anglo-Saxon racial element. WASPs transformed into European Americans. In other words, WASP was replaced by WEP, White European Protestant. Anglo-Saxon gave way to European. But notice what remained unchanged: the white at the beginning and Protestant at the end. Even Catholicism changed in America. The Vatican repeatedly complained that American Catholic churches were contaminated by Protestantism. In mafia-themed movies, we often see an interesting dynamic. American mafia members return to their Sicilian homeland. There, they have communication difficulties with local mafia. American culture had changed them. Compared to their assimilation of other whites, WASPs were unsuccessful in assimilating other races. Perhaps they never truly wanted to. After all, skin color was different. People at that time generally believed in racial theory. They were firmly convinced that whites were the superior race. In their view, Mongoloids, Blacks, and Native Americans followed in that order. With such different skin colors, intermarriage was extremely difficult. Without intermarriage, true integration could not be achieved. Black people gained voting rights after fighting in the Civil War. But these rights were not complete. Southern state and county governments imposed various restrictions. They required tests to determine whether a voter could understand the Constitution. Could they comprehend the separation of powers? Did they grasp the concept of citizenship? At that time, most black people were illiterate. They couldn't pass these tests. The few who were literate and attempted to vote faced threats. So, you see what happened? After fighting and sacrificing their lives, black people became instruments for white integration. They were exploited once again. True political equality for black people didn't come until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. From the 14th Amendment in 1868 that granted black people voting rights, to making these rights effective, an entire century passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally accomplished this. Integration for other ethnicities, such as Asian Americans, was even more difficult. America enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. It prohibited Chinese and all Asian immigration. The justification was that Chinese people were incompatible and lived in isolation. They clung to their native customs and could not be assimilated. They would allegedly constitute a threat to our civilization. America rejected not just Chinese, but all Asian immigrants. During Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, he specifically warned Japan. He said Japanese immigrants would also be expelled. He suggested the Japanese government restrict immigration itself to avoid embarrassment for both sides. The ban on Asian immigration wasn't lifted until 1952. In other words, until the mid-20th century, America remained a white society. To summarize, from the early 17th century until the 1960s, 350 years, WASP preserved specific elements of their identity. They kept the W at the beginning and the P at the end. They sacrificed the middle AS, Anglo-Saxon racial concept. In this process, they expelled Asians and dishonestly rejected black integration. From tomato soup to salad. Logically, America's political system is a republic. This means differences between states should be their strength. These differences are the charm of its political system. But when Martin Luther King Jr. launched the civil rights movement, something changed. American society had lost the buffering capacity that a republican system should have. This made social division unavoidable. There were several reasons for this. The Civil War exacted an extremely high price. After the Civil War, the idea of states seceding from a union became politically unthinkable. Additionally, the 20th century brought new challenges. There were 2 world wars followed by the Cold War. Powerful external enemies united Americans. America's subsequent global leadership position strengthened everyone's identification with America as a nation. In Jefferson's era, people viewed their state as their homeland. They saw the federal government as a supranational organization, like today's European Union. This thinking had been completely abandoned. This explains an interesting contrast we see today. Quebec, Catalonia, and Scotland have serious independence movements. Meanwhile, independence talk in California, Florida, or Texas is merely treated as a joke. Roosevelt leveraged both the Great Depression and World War II. He greatly expanded federal power. He also created intricate connections between federal authority and the welfare system. James Madison once said that humans needing government was evidence of our species' depravity. If Madison could see today's massive federal government, he would be shocked. This America is far from what the Founding Fathers wanted. These were men described as dissenters among dissenters, Protestants among Protestants. Isaiah Berlin made an interesting prediction about Roosevelt. He said Roosevelt might be hated during his lifetime, but would be loved after death. Indeed, Roosevelt's New Deal forever changed American society. As we mentioned in the oath, the Supreme Court during the 1960s made crucial decisions. Under Chief Justice Earl Warren, the court accelerated social change dramatically. They stepped on the gas instead of the brake. This made it impossible for states to handle racial integration gradually. The option for states to approach black-white integration through a step-by-step process vanished. Thus, the civil rights movement unfolded in a very intense manner. On the surface, black people won a great victory. Segregation was prohibited. The Voting Rights Act created new protection. It stipulated that if a district's black voter turnout was less than 50% of the average, the election would be invalid. Additionally, districts were deliberately drawn along racial lines. This was done to ensure the election of black representatives. After segregation ended, many black people moved into cities. However, hope for integration didn't happen. Once black residents reached about 25% of the neighborhood, white residents typically voted with their feet. They simply moved to the suburbs. Before, segregation was enforced by law. Now it lived in people's hearts. The civil rights movement's rapid approach created social divisions that persist today. In Huntington's metaphor, America's tomato soup was poured out and replaced with salad bowl. I'm not saying the civil rights movement was bad. Ending segregation was necessary, but because of accumulated historical injustices, a gradual approach might have worked better. There should have been steps and processes. For example, regarding attitudes toward black people, the federal government could have mandated an 80% baseline standard. They could have allowed states 20% flexibility for local adjustment. Instead, they implemented a one-size-fits-all approach at the federal level. This made subsequent social division unavoidable. If American identity issues were limited to black people, it might be less concerning. Justice O'Connor once said that white Americans had done many wrong things. She acknowledged the need to compensate black people. But since it's compensation, paying a debt, there should be a time limit. Justice O'Connor suggested compensation for 50 years. Counting from the 1960s, that 50-year period has now passed. Although problems haven't been completely resolved, race relations are at least moving in a better direction. But now, America's identity problems are becoming increasingly serious. Huntington gives a striking example in his book. In February 1988, Mexico and the United States played a soccer match. There were 91,255 spectators. The stadium was filled with Mexican flags. When American players entered the field, spectators threw rocks and cups at them. Some even urinated on them. You might think this match took place in Mexico City. No, it was in Los Angeles. An assaulted fan angrily said, "I got beaten up for waving an American flag at a match in America. This is ridiculous." Why did something like this happen?